Frank Miles was enjoying his stay on the Naglfari with his two children, Milton and Fiona. The trip was a prize for meeting his sales goals in selling fridges across Europa. So, as a way of saying thank you for a job well done, his work gave him a 2-week cruise on the Naglfari, headed from Portishead, Albion, to Imperial City in the Empire of the Seven Cities, where his wife, Violet Miles, would be waiting for them all. She works for the Emperor's staff and was considered too valuable to leave the Empire. The Emperor feared either her assassination, or worse, her arrest, of one of his most valuable staff. So, Frank went on the cruise alone with just him and his two kids. But he was excited to see his wife again for the first time in almost 8 months, since he spent most of his time working in Europa and was often in Gaul, and so was his kids. Frank watched as his children played in the water park while he idly read his book. He was mostly paying attention to his kids, but his kids often felt they had more fun when they thought he wasn't watching too closely. But they also felt safest knowing he was nearby. So, while he sat and relaxed, he thought about his wife's face and voice. She had some of the kindest eyes he had ever seen, and she had one of the most soothing voices he had ever heard. Her voice flowed from one word to another. Even simple phrases turned to poetry. It flowed through her normally. The only times her words didn't flow was when she was lying or trying to hide something from him. Violet was able to hide things from most everyone else, but when she tried to hide gifts from him or convince the kids that the gifts under the tree were totally from Mary Lloyd and not from their parents, her voice would turn into a stern lecture, every word and the intonation chosen carefully, and a tone of, "Don't question me." Even after 13 years of marriage and 2 children, Frank has never questioned her. While lost in thought of his wife, Frank's thoughts immediately turned to his children, an almost supernatural sense. Before Milton even fell, Frank felt himself tense up. While Milton was lying sprawled on the ground, processing the pain, before he could even open his mouth, Frank was already walking over to him. By the time Milton was crying, Frank was already crouched over his son, and already Frank could see a bruise forming on his son's knee where he tripped and skinned it. He fell, running next to the pool. Kissing his son's knee, he asked, "What happened?" "I fell." "Oh? Why did you fall?" "I was running." "Were you supposed to be running?" "No." Frank kissed the skinned and bruised knee again. "Does it still hurt?" "Yes, it burns," Milton told his dad. Frank nodded and held his chin like he was a detective solving a case. Milton loved it when his dad treated his problems like they were cases to solve. Even at 7 years old, Milton loved hearing about detective cases, and he even followed some of the cases of the detective Red Prince over in River City. So, naturally, it was a good way to distract his son from his own injury. Well, if you fell while you were running, do you think they were connected?" Milton nodded as a response, looking at his own knee. The blood was starting to blossom, so he was going to need an adhesive bandage, and he was probably burning from the salt in the water. The Naglfari had salt water in all of its pools, maybe to save money on chlorine. "I think you fell because you were running, and I think it burns because of the water in the pool. So, what do you think we need to do, Walton?" Frank asked his son. Walton was a reference to a sidekick in some of Milton's detective stories, so getting called Walton made Milton brighten up. Sure enough, it worked even now. Milton brightened up and looked deep in thought. "I think I need to go to the room, wash away the poison, and we need to cover my wound," he said, trying to sound like a serious doctor assistant. but he couldn't help smiling. He picked up a lot of big words, but he didn't always use them quite correctly. Still, in Frank's mind, it was a good start. Turning his back to Milton and crouching down, he called back, "Get on my back. We'll get you to the cabin and get you cleaned up and patched up," Frank said, before feeling Milton wrap his hands around his neck, holding his son, and he carried him on his back while he walked over to where Fiona was. She was swimming laps across the pool. She was a bit older than her younger brother, at 9 years old, but she enjoyed the feeling of swimming, much like she was a mermaid. Her swimsuit even had fake scales and sparkled in the water, just like a mermaid, from how much she loved it. "Come on, Fiona, we gotta get Walton here up to the cabin to patch him up," Frank called out to his daughter. She swam up to him, her head bobbing out of the water, her face in a deep frown. She even used her fingers to pull her frown down further, to make it very clear she was not happy about it. Fiona could speak, but she didn't like speaking where people she didn't know could hear her. Where Milton was a fan of detective stories and mysteries, Fiona loved stories of fairies and magical creatures. This often manifested in odd quirks, counting every step to make sure the stair wasn't infinite, refusing to give her names to others, not wanting to speak in public, and calling everyone she didn't know or didn't trust a fellow traveler. So, when she wanted to prove a point, she would often exaggerate her emotions. "Come on, princess, you can play games while I take care of your brother. Afterwards we can talk about dinner." Fiona stopped frowning and started to smile, even pulling up the corners of her mouth with her fingers to show how much she liked her idea, before lifting herself out of the pool and walking alongside her dad. Even though there were just 2 steps leading from the pool to the walkway, she counted them. Frank carried his son on his back and watched his daughter look down at the ground, refusing to look any of the fellow travelers in the eye, and not wanting to lose count of the stairs as they gradually made their way to their suite. Walking down the hallway, Frank saw that there was a house cleaner who was struggling to keep standing. She was very pale, and every step was a struggle. One hand was grabbing at her stomach, while her other gloved hand held the wall to keep her steady. The house cleaner was facing away from them, but even facing away, he could see how pale and flushed her skin was. Frank began to walk towards her as carefully as he could, figuring that she was either seasick or having a rough night. Eager to get his kids away from her, Frank saw Fiona freeze, and she made 2 fists in front of her chest. One fist faced her chest, and the other hovered above it. The top fist almost touched the bottom one as it seemed to bounce up. Fiona was signing that there was danger. Looking at the house cleaner ahead, Frank figured it would be best to humor her. The house cleaner did look very sick, and if it made the kids feel safer to go a different way, then he would do it. Turning down an empty hallway, Frank half led and half carried his kids to the cabin suite. It took a few extra minutes, but they made it there without any incident, and without going near the house cleaner. And now, opening the door to the cabin, they went into the suite. The cabin suite was near the top deck. It had a master bedroom and an adjoining bedroom. The children would get the master bedroom, while Frank took the smaller bedroom. Partially it was so they could enjoy the larger room, but it was also good for Frank also. The master bedroom had a massive television with seemingly every game system known to humanity, and the adjoining room was small and quiet, perfect for Frank to sleep, while his kids could play games late into the night, as late as they wanted to. He took Milton to the bathroom and opened the first aid kit. As he began to clean and dress the skinned knee, Fiona stood in the doorway, like she was standing guard. "Why were you signing danger?" Frank asked her. Since they were alone in the cabin, she was more likely to say what was happening. "Babon Sith." she was going to bite us if we got close, Fiona explained just as Frank finished up putting the bandage on his son's knee. Frank remembered telling the tale of Babone Sith to Fiona. It was like a vampire. It was a fairy of sorts, but that could bite a person and either drink their blood or eat their flesh. Well, we are away from her, and safe here, right? Frank asked. Fiona eyed the door and then her dad before nodding. Safe, she agreed. Let's see if we can get changed before dinner, Frank said, before heading to his room to change. But before he could make it through the door, he heard the PA crackle to life, before the captain's voice came through and spoke. There has been an outbreak of bacterial meningitis on the ship. I am asking all guests and staff to quarantine in their cabins until Vanguard arrives to evacuate everyone. It shouldn't take longer than a few hours. Remember, do not open the cabin until the Vanguard arrives. The last word sounded almost worried. As a way of saying sorry for the inconvenience, all minibars are now complimentary. This time, it sounded like he was reading off a prompt before the PA cut out. Dad, what's quarantine? Milton asked his father. Well, it means we have to stay in the cabin so we don't get sick, until the doctors come and get us. Aww, both his kids said at the same time. They were disappointed they didn't get to keep playing in the water park and no dinner at the buffet tonight. Something that they all looked forward to each night. Still, Frank knew how to pivot the disappointment into joy. Do you know what complimentary means? Frank asked his children. Milton shook his head and Fiona shrugged dramatically. Does that mean the fridge is going to give us compliments? Milton suggested. Frank responded by shaking his head and looking at Fiona. When he asked these kinds of questions, he wanted answers from both of them. It helped make sure they were both involved in choices and in learning equally. Extra snacks? Fiona asked. Frank shook his head and responded. You're both kinda close. It means that all the snacks in the fridge are free as a set way of saying sorry and to compliment us. It took a moment before the realization dawned on his children. On the very first day they got on the shift, they asked for the snacks in the fridge, even though it was cheaper to get snacks pretty much anywhere else and bring them into the room. The fact that the children could see the snacks made them as tempting as cursed gold. The price was much higher to pay than they were willing to pay, but still it remained. Just behind the glass, with the light always on, there was choice candies, delectable delights, mouth-watering microwavables, and sweet sodas, all on display to the children. And since it was a suite, the fridge wasn't a mini fridge that could barely hold a carton of soda. It was a double-wide fridge taller than Frank was tall, with 2 doors side to side. Fit to feed a family of dozens, and it was stocked from everything from frozen fish fillets to simple Sunday supplies. Practically a buffet in itself. Already the children were running to the fridge and they tore open the doors, going through the candy first, following a child's logic of dessert first. Don't drink the tiny bottles, Frank warned before heading to his room to change. Even though they were on vacation, he didn't want them drinking alcohol. He wasn't worried, since he doesn't drink, and he doubted they would start in the 5 minutes it took him to change. Sure enough, when he came back in his pajamas, Fiona already had a pile of gummy centipedes and gothic raspberries on a plate, pretending that the centipedes were eating the candy berry as she ate them both. Milton had a bowl of whipped cream topped with chocolate shavings and hot dogs that he ate as ravenously as it was ambrosia. Glad to see you both like it, Frank said as he removed some fillets before putting them on the paper plates that came with the fridge. Microwaving it, he watched as his children ate up. Well, I think it might be a good time to watch some movies. What do you think? He asked as they both squealed in happiness, Movie, they said together, while Frank figured out the television that apparently took an engineering degree to figure out. Apparently, the captain made the movies all complimentary too. A wonderful bonus. Putting it on the newest movie to come into theaters, Frank ate impromptu dinner with his kids. It didn't take long for them to fall asleep. They were asleep before the big movie finale. Taking the paper plates and putting them in the trash, Frank checked the door to the cabin. The deadbolt was on and the latch was firm. Heading to bed, he checked on his children one last time. Both asleep in the master bed, the light of the movie splashing across them as he closed the door to his bedroom and went to his bed. Comfortably asleep and dreaming before he knew it. The quarantine was sudden, but he was quite proud with how quickly his children bounced back. Frank woke up the next morning to knocking at the cabin door. Groggily, he headed to the door, about to open it until he remembered that they weren't supposed to open it for anyone but the vanguard. Calling out through the door, he asked, "Who is it?" There was a pause, but a woman's voice responded, "Vanguard, here to evacuate you." Opening the door, Frank looked out to see strange figures in front of him. They both wore leather jackets, paper mask covers, and green shirts with a golden shield on the front, with golden antlers sprouting from the shield. Frank was not familiar with the symbol. He thought that the Vanguard had a snake on a stick, but they still seemed honest. "Please, we need to evacuate quickly. Please grab everything you need. Eat and let's go," the woman asked. Neither of them introduced themselves. The man kept glancing around like he was expecting a fight at any moment, and he carried a crossbow in his arms. It was, thankfully, aimed at the floor, but still a scary wake-up call. The woman had a more relaxed look and didn't carry any weapons as far as Frank could see, but there was a lot of curiosity in her eyes. Like she was seeing everything in the room at the same time, but the world had to catch up to what she was seeing. Yeah, can we get dressed? Get your shoes on, yes, but everything else gets into your luggage. Sure, okay. Frank responded by turning around to wake his kids. They were groggy, but they quickly got their shoes on when they saw the Vanguard there. Vanguard are emergency workers, filling in any role police couldn't do. They operate internationally, but they were especially popular in the Empire of the Seven Cities. As Frank had his shoes on and so did his kids, they grabbed their luggage. Fortunately, Frank always taught his kids to keep everything when they're on vacation in a single briefcase. Even in their room, all their clothes and important items were in the briefcases at all times, ready to grab and go. Frank had a bit of a fear that there would be a moment just like this, when they would have to leave quickly. In less than a minute, they were ready and joining the Vanguard outside. Despite the man with the crossbow staring down at them, neither Fiona nor Milton seemed afraid of him, and Frank also had to focus on staying calm. The man stayed in the back of the group, led by Frank, who wanted to watch his kids and keep some distance between the man and his children, and then in front of the children was the woman, who led the way. She then took them off the ship in one of the longest and strangest routes that Frank had ever seen. She would often take 3 lefts instead of 1 right, and before opening any door, she would rest her hand on it just for a moment and close her eyes. Almost like if she was trying to see if the door was hot, like there was a fire somewhere on board. Which, as far as Frank knew, there might have been. They didn't see anyone else as they trekked through the ship. There were lots of spilled clothes, dropped drinks, overturned chairs, and even briefcases, but no actual people. "What happened to everyone?" Milton asked. It was the woman who responded. Most of them already left. You were some of the last people to leave. But if most already left, wouldn't that mean there are some who didn't leave? Milton asked. It was the man who responded. Don't worry, we'll make sure no one is left behind. Something about the man's words felt like a cold fog washing over the group. Now near the tendering area, the woman hissed. Fuck! No way around. I need a favor from you all. I need you all to look down and follow my feet. Step where I step, and most importantly, don't look up, she ordered. Why don't we look up? Milton asked. There were a lot of people who were sick, and when people get sick, sometimes they leave gross things behind. I don't want you seeing it. If you see the sick, you're going to get sick, she answered. This made sense to the children, who immediately kept their heads down, and Frank followed suit, watching his kids' feet ahead as they all stepped forward carefully. Still, curiosity piqued his interest. Glancing up for just a second with just his eyes, he saw the main play area of the ship, where just yesterday Milton and Fiona played in the water park. Now what Frank saw was only a glimpse, and it was only for just a second, but it was more than enough. The first thing he noticed was a lot of brown sticky fluid near the pool's edge and inside of the pool. At first, Frank assumed it was spilled soda, until he noticed something floating in the pool. It leaked something red as it bobbed on the small waves. Frank figured it was a pool toy at first, but pool toys aren't normally that big. Pool toys also didn't leak, and they definitely didn't leak red. And most importantly, pool toys didn't move while face down in the water. Frank felt the man's hand on the back of his neck, forcing him to keep looking at the ground, while they all headed to the tending area. Stay focused, he whispered to Frank. It was less ominous and felt more like it was giving advice. Deciding to follow it, Frank kept walking, and they all made it to the tending area with no other problems. When cruise ships make it to port, oftentimes people simply can't walk from the dock to the cruise ship. Tendering was the process of a small boat attaching to the cruise ship to carry passengers to the dock. Here, there was already a boat attached to the ship. Here, there were doctors in white scrubs with the snake and the stick symbol and everything else, who saw the group approaching. The doctors rushed forward when they saw them and started asking everyone in the group strange questions. They even asked the odd man and woman, Are you nauseous? Have you or anyone you know recently vomited blood? Do you have any strange cravings or sudden increases in appetite? Have you or anyone you know recently got a fever? Have you been bitten by a rabid animal or person lately? After Frank answered no to all the doctor's questions for himself and for his children, who were too scared to answer the doctors, Frank couldn't blame them. In their full body suits, mirrored visor, and electronic voices, they more closely resembled aliens in a monster movie than they did benevolent healers. The doctors, after asking all of their questions, finally escorted Frank and his children to an even smaller boat, where there was a single cabin and a pilot house. The man inside the pilot house wouldn't respond to Frank at all. Even the door to the pilot house was locked. The man inside staring daggers at Frank and his children. Nowhere else to go, they went inside the cabin. Inside there were 4 small cots, a little toilet closet, and little else. The entire cabin was smaller than the master bedroom on the Naglfari. The small boat, barely bigger than a dinghy, began to cough to life and slowly make its way towards the shore. On the way back to shore, Frank and his children took turns telling stories and occasionally looking out of the window to see Oceanus. Even in the small boat, Frank and his children enjoyed the views of the ocean. After 7 hours in the cabin, they could finally see the shore approach. Finally near the shore, Frank went out with his children. Still all in their pajamas and the dock in sight, Frank could see a surprise. He saw his wife. "Look, Mom's here," he said, picking up both his children so they could see her. They both waved to her while she waved back. Frank couldn't be certain, but it looked like she might have been crying. When the boat finally docked and the gangway touched the dock, Frank and his kids weren't even off the boat before Violet ran on to kiss her husband and hug both her children. I missed you too, honey. When we heard about the meningitis outbreak, we just did what they said and waited in our room," Frank told her. "Meningitis? You were told it was meningitis? When I heard what was on the Naglfari, I thought... Violet's musical voice went up and down before it flattened and she spoke with precision. "I was worried you were sick. I missed you all so much." Her flat voice lied to her husband and children. Frank had heard his wife lie before. He heard the subtle speech when lying about Mary Lloyd to his children. He heard the perfect pitch when he denied hiding the anniversary gift. But if those lies were whispers before, then this was an air raid siren, screaming to Frank that she was hiding something huge. Before he could ask what she was talking about, he saw her pleading eyes. They glanced behind her, where Frank could see men pretending to work at the docks. It was subtle at first, but if you paid attention, you could see it. A dock worker who would pick up a big pile of rope from a crate before moving it to another crate, then picking it up again and moving it back to the original crate. A fisherman who didn't have a cooler with him, but he had a rod that looked as new as tomorrow while he stood at the docks. Or how there was someone sweeping the same section of the dock, never bothering to move to a new section or even adjust their pace. "Hello, travelers," Fiona said in a tone that indicated she wasn't talking about fairies. "Well, I'm glad to see you again, honey," he said, smiling and kissing her again, as he felt her relax a fraction of a centimeter. She knew something he didn't, and as much as she wanted to tell him, it wasn't safe to tell him. The Emperor would be keeping a close eye on her and all of them, and this would remain a secret that she would have to bear alone. And even though he didn't know what really happened on that ship, he could tell that it really worried her. Frank would do his best to support her, to reassure Violet that he still trusted her, even when she had secrets and couldn't tell him everything. It would be tough, but the entire family had a lot of practice. They could all see the sword that dangled above Violet's head. She had money, she had power, she had influence, but the sword still dangled above her, suspended by a single golden thread. If she moved too quick, it would fall on her. If she spoke wrong, it would fall on her. If she acknowledged it, it would fall on her. If she even looked at it, it would fall on her. And the sword wouldn't just fall on her. Frank was aware, even though he couldn't see it, there were bound to be swords dangling above his head, and above Fiona's head, and above Milton's head. The only thing Violet could do was make sure that the thread didn't break. But even if she did everything she was supposed to, and stayed under the dangling death, pretending it was never there, never even looking up and doing everything she was told, and always doing everything she was supposed to, it may still fall on her and her family anyways, for any reason or no reason at all. and that was what she was afraid of here, but she couldn't speak about it. If she did, she would give the sword too much power. But it was clear to Frank, even if it was unspoken. Violet was afraid what happened on that boat was the swords falling onto her family. And now she was relieved that the swords hadn't fallen on them. Not yet, at least.